I was halfway through loading my duffel into Dad's truck when he came outside with his phone still pressed to his ear, and the expression he wore whenever work had just ruined something. He ended the call, looked at me, then at Grant Mercer standing beside his own truck with 2 fishing rods balanced against one shoulder. "I can't go," Dad said. "Emergency at the office." For a second, I thought the whole trip was over. It was supposed to be our annual fishing weekend. Dad, Grant, and me 3 days at the lake, too much coffee, bad jokes, and my father pretending he knew more about fish than either of us. I reached for my bag. "Then we'll reschedule. Cabin's already paid for," Grant said. I looked at him. At 42, he had the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who never seemed surprised by bad news. He lowered the rods and added, "Supplies are packed. Weather's decent until Sunday. No reason we can't still go." Dad smiled like the problem had solved itself. I didn't. "You mean you and me?" Grant met my eyes. "Unless you've suddenly developed a fear of lakes." That made Dad laugh. I should have laughed too. Instead, something tight and strange moved through my chest. Grant had been around for as long as I could remember. Dad's closest friend, the guy who showed up at birthdays, helped move furniture, brought beer to cookouts. But we had never spent more than a few minutes alone together. "Not really." "Your call," Grant said, no pressure in his voice. That somehow made it harder to say no. 10 minutes later, Dad was gone and I was climbing into Grant's passenger seat. A coffee waited in the cup holder. I picked it up and frowned. "Black, 1 sugar." Grant started the engine. "That's still right?" "Yeah." I looked over at him. "How do you know that?" His hand paused briefly on the gearshift. "Your dad talks." Maybe. Except Dad barely remembered how I took my coffee. And Grant had somehow packed the old spinning rod I used every summer when I was 19. The one I thought had disappeared into my father's garage years ago. I glanced back at it through the rear window. Grant pulled onto the road toward the lake, sunlight flashing across the windshield. I told myself he was simply prepared. That was Grant. Organized. Thoughtful. Dad's reliable best friend. Still, as the houses thinned behind us and the highway opened ahead, one question stayed with me. Why did Grant Mercer seem to know exactly what I liked? By the time we reached the lake, the awkwardness I had expected had mostly disappeared. Grant never tried to fill every silence, which made the drive easier. At the cabin, we unloaded coolers, tackle boxes, groceries, and enough gear to survive a month instead of 3 days. Grant handed me the keys while he carried supplies toward the dock. "You trust me with the cabin?" I asked. "I trust you with more expensive things than a cabin." "Like what?" He glanced toward the boat. "My chances of catching anything this weekend." I laughed and followed him down. The easy rhythm continued. I carried equipment while Grant checked the boat. Then we switched without discussing it. He never hovered or explained things I already knew. When I struggled with the reel on my old spinning rod, he watched me work instead of reaching over to fix it. "You going to help?" I asked. "You don't need help." Very supportive. "I'm serious." I finally freed the jammed line. Grant gave me a small, satisfied smile. "See?" It surprised me how much I liked being treated that way. Not as Tom Cole's son. Just Ethan. We spent the afternoon near the dock preparing for the next morning. At one point, spray from the boat soaked the front of my light overshirt. I pulled it off and draped it over the railing, leaving me in the t-shirt underneath. When I turned back, Grant was looking at me, not casually. His eyes stayed on me one beat too long before shifting toward the water. "Something wrong?" I asked. "No," his answer came quickly. Too quickly. He bent over the tackle box and became extremely interested in organizing hooks. I let it go, although the moment followed me back to the cabin. That evening, Grant made coffee while I sorted groceries. He placed a mug beside me without asking. I tasted it. "Black, 1 sugar." Again. "Okay," I said. "This is getting weird." Grant leaned against the counter with his own mug. "What is?" "You know my coffee. You found my old rod. You remembered I hate those powdered creamers you almost bought at the gas station." His mouth twitched. Your dad talks about you. Dad called me last month to ask what year I graduated college. Grant laughed, but something changed behind his eyes. He remembers the important things. Apparently you remember the unimportant ones. For the first time all day, Grant looked genuinely uncomfortable. He lowered his mug. Some things stick. Then he turned toward the window and asked whether I wanted to be on the water early. It was an obvious escape and I allowed it. How early? 6. That's not morning. That's punishment. His shoulders relaxed. I'll make the coffee. Later, lying in the small bedroom across the hall from his, I replayed the afternoon despite myself. Grant watching me at the dock, his quick look away, the careful way he had answered my questions. There were reasonable explanations for all of it. Grant had known my family for years. Dad talked. Grant remembered things. None of that had to mean anything. But somewhere between the highway and that quiet cabin, Grant had stopped feeling like my father's best friend. And I had started wondering whether he had noticed the same thing. Grant was already awake when my alarm went off. I knew because the smell of coffee had reached my room before I opened the door. My mug waited on the counter exactly the way I liked it. Neither of us mentioned our conversation from the night before. By 6:30, we were moving across the lake beneath a pale morning sky, the cabin shrinking behind us. For the first hour, the water stayed calm. Grant steered us farther out while I gave him grief about choosing a spot where apparently every fish had received advance warning. Patience, he said. That what you tell Dad when you're losing? Your father talks less than you do. Now I know you're lying. Grant smiled, and whatever tension had survived breakfast loosened. Then the wind changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. The boat simply began rocking harder, small waves slapping against the hull. Grant looked toward the far side of the lake, his expression sharpening. We're heading back. Started securing the loose equipment while he turned the boat. A tackle box shifted near my feet. I reached for it at the same moment the boat rolled unexpectedly beneath me. My shoe slipped. I barely had time to throw out a hand before Grant caught me around the waist and hauled me backward. I hit his chest instead of the deck. Ethan. His voice sounded different. I steadied myself, one hand gripping his forearm. I'm okay. Grant kept hold of me. His other hand moved quickly over my shoulder, then my arm, checking for an injury that wasn't there. Grant, I'm fine. I know. He looked directly at me, breathing harder than the moment deserved. Just give me a second. Something in my chest went still. The danger had passed. I was standing securely, yet his hand remained against my side, firm and warm through my shirt. Then Grant seemed to realize exactly where it was. He released me and stepped back. Sit down until we're closer to shore. I almost slipped. I didn't fall overboard. Ethan. Fine. I sat, but I watched him as he guided us toward the cabin. His jaw stayed tight. He checked on me twice without pretending he wasn't doing it. By the time we reached calmer water, I could no longer convince myself his reaction had been ordinary. At the dock, I helped tie off the boat. You always panic like that when Dad nearly trips? I asked. Grant gave me a look. Your father could fall through a roof and complain about whoever built the floor. I laughed despite myself. So that's a no. He started gathering the gear. It means I knew you were my responsibility out there. There it was again. A reasonable explanation delivered just a little too carefully. Because I'm Tom's son? Grant stopped. For a moment he said nothing. Then he lifted the tackle box. Because you were with me. That answer followed me up the dock. Near the cabin, Grant added, almost as if he regretted the silence. I nearly didn't come this year. I turned. Why? His expression closed immediately. Doesn't matter. Dad had to convince you? Yeah. Why? Grant looked past me toward the restless lake. Weather's getting worse. We should get everything inside. Then he walked toward the cabin before I could ask again. I stood there with my old fishing rod in my hand, watching him leave. Yesterday I could tell myself Grant was simply observant. Today I could tell myself he had grabbed me because anyone would have. But I couldn't explain why a man who had nearly refused this trip had looked genuinely frightened when I almost fell, or why, for those few seconds in the boat, neither of us had seemed to remember that he was supposed to be only my father's best friend. By the time we had carried the last of the gear inside, rain was striking the cabin windows hard enough to erase the far side of the lake. Grant checked the weather, then set his phone face down on the table. "We're done with the boat for today. You say that like I was planning to swim back out there. After this morning, I'm not ruling anything out. The joke should have reset things between us. Didn't. With nowhere to go and nothing urgent left to do, the cabin suddenly felt smaller. We made lunch, repaired a damaged tackle rig, and spent the afternoon moving around each other with an awareness that hadn't existed yesterday. Every time Grant came close, I remembered his arm around my waist on the boat. Every time he stepped away, I noticed that too. By evening, we were cooking dinner together while rain drummed steadily against the roof. I asked him about a woman Dad had once mentioned. "Melissa," Grant said. "That ended years ago." Dad made it sound serious. "Your dad thinks 3 dates means you should start comparing mortgage rates." I laughed. "There were others, though." Grant glanced at me. "Is this an interrogation? We're trapped in a cabin. I need entertainment. Then tell me about your love life." Deflection. "Absolutely." I handed him a plate. "Fine. Mine's uncomplicated." "That isn't the word I'd use." I looked at him. "What would you use?" Grant hesitated. "Temporary." The answer landed harder than I expected. "You've been keeping records? Your dad talks, remember?" Convenient excuse. "Is it wrong?" I leaned against the counter. "I date. Sometimes it works for a while. Then it doesn't. You leave." "Sometimes. Usually." I stared at him. Grant's expression had lost its teasing edge. "You really have been paying attention." He looked down at the food instead of answering. The rain filled the silence. "Maybe I just know the type," he said eventually. "What type is that?" "Someone who leaves before the other person gets the chance." I wanted to dismiss it, but the words found something too accurate. "Maybe leaving first is easier." Grant looked at me again. "Easier than what?" I shrugged, suddenly wishing I had never started the conversation. "Finding out someone can take you or leave you." Something shifted in his face. He stepped closer, not enough to touch me, but enough that I stopped thinking about dinner. "Ethan," he said quietly, "anyone who finds you easy to leave was never paying attention." I held his gaze. "Have you been paying attention?" Grant went completely still. He could have laughed. He could have mentioned Dad again. Instead, he said nothing. The silence answered more than either excuse would have. I turned toward the table at the same moment he reached for the plate beside me. Our hands came within inches. Neither of us moved for a beat. Then Grant pulled his hand back as though proximity itself had become dangerous. "We should eat," he said. I let him step away. I let us finish dinner without asking the question again. But later, while we sat on opposite sides of the cabin listening to the storm, I understood that something had changed. Grant had spent 2 days giving me explanations for every look, every remembered detail, every moment of concern. Tonight, when I finally asked the only question that mattered, he hadn't been able to give me one. And for the first time, I was almost certain I knew why. The rain eased sometime before dawn, and by late afternoon the lake looked almost harmless again. Grant checked the forecast twice before agreeing we could take the boat out. "Short run," he said. "We stay close. You're becoming very controlling. You almost fell yesterday." Almost. His expression told me the distinction meant nothing to him. We kept to the safer side of the lake, fishing beneath a sky that remained gray but steady. For a while, neither of us mentioned the night. Before, that silence felt different now. I knew Grant had been paying attention. He knew I knew. We were simply pretending the question between us could remain unanswered. Then the wind shifted again. Grant noticed first. He looked toward the darkening water and started the motor. "We're going back." This time I didn't argue. The return wasn't dramatic, but the waves rose quickly enough that we had to work together. I secured the equipment while Grant kept the boat pointed toward shore. When one hard wave knocked me against the side, his head snapped toward me. "Ethan, I'm fine. Watch the water." He did, but I saw the fear in his face again. We reached the dock safely and hauled the gear inside before the rain returned. Only when the boat was secured did Grant finally relax. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes." "You sure?" "Grant." He stopped. I stepped closer. "Why do you keep looking at me like something terrible is going to happen?" "Because conditions changed fast." "That isn't what I asked." His jaw tightened. "I was responsible for you out there. Because I'm Dad's son?" "Ethan, you already tried that answer." He looked away. I waited. Eventually he said, "Your father has nothing to do with how scared I was." The words settled between us. For days I had been searching for proof that I wasn't imagining this. Now I had it, and somehow it only opened a bigger question. Maybe danger did strange things to people. Maybe being isolated together had turned ordinary concern into something neither of us would recognize at home. I didn't want an answer born from adrenaline, so I let the moment end. Hours later, we were dry, fed, and sitting on the covered porch. The lake had quieted. Nothing was happening. Nothing needed saving. Grant sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. "You've been avoiding me since dinner yesterday," I said. "I'm sitting right here." "That isn't what I mean." He stared across the dark water. "I know." My pulse accelerated. "If this is just the trip, say it." Grant turned toward me. "Just the trip. The cabin. The weather. Being stuck together. Whatever happened on that boat." His eyes stayed on mine. "And if it isn't?" Swallowed. "Then stop making me guess." Grant didn't move. I gave him every chance to step away. "You can go inside," I said. "I won't follow you. Tomorrow we can pretend I never asked." Something almost painful crossed his face. "You think that would make this easier?" "I think it gives you a choice." For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Grant leaned toward me, slowly enough that I could stop him. Slowly enough that there was no possibility of mistaking what he was doing. His hand touched the side of my face, and he kissed me. There was no storm around us, no slipping deck, no reason for him to hold me. Kissed him back. For one impossible moment, every strange look and unfinished sentence from the last 3 days seemed to converge into something simple. Grant wanted me, then he pulled away. His hand dropped. "We shouldn't have done that." The warmth in my chest turned sharp. "Don't, Ethan. Don't kiss me because you want to and then call it a mistake because you're scared of what it means." He looked at me, shaken and silent. "I didn't say it was a mistake. You were about to." Grant looked toward the lake again, but there was nowhere left for either of us to hide. I finally knew he wanted me. What I didn't know was whether Grant Mercer would still want me when there was no cabin, no lake, and no fishing trip left to blame. The next morning, Grant made coffee as if the kiss had never happened. That might have worked if he hadn't placed my mug beside me without asking, black with 1 sugar, and then pulled his hand away before our fingers could touch. I looked at him across the counter. "Are we really doing this?" "Doing what?" "Pretending." His shoulders tightened. "I'm trying not to make things worse." "You kissed me, Grant. Things are already different." He stared into his coffee. "I know." We spent the morning near the cabin, sorting tackle and checking the boat after the weather. Grant kept finding reasons to put several feet between us. But distance didn't erase what had happened. If anything, every deliberate step backward made the kiss feel more real. By afternoon, I was done cooperating. I found him at the dock securing equipment. "You said you almost didn't come this year." Grant stopped working. "Ethan, was it because of me?" His silence gave me the first part of the answer. "How long?" I asked. Grant looked toward the lake. "Long enough that I knew better than to put myself in this situation." My stomach tightened. "What situation?" "Being alone with you." He finally faced me. "This didn't start here." I said nothing. "A few years ago, after you'd moved out, built your own life, something changed for me." His voice was controlled, but his expression wasn't. You weren't Tom's kid showing up at cookouts anymore. You were a grown man, and I started noticing you as one. The words hit me harder than the kiss had. Grant continued before I could answer. I hated that I noticed, so I kept my distance. If I knew you'd be somewhere, I made sure we weren't alone. When Tom started planning this trip, I almost backed out. The old rod, the coffee, the looks he kept cutting short. Suddenly they belonged to a history I hadn't known existed. Dad convinced you to come. Yeah. And then Dad canceled. Grant gave a humorless laugh. Exactly. So you've wanted me for years? Don't make it sound simple. I'm trying to understand it. I'm your father's best friend. I know who you are. And I remember you growing up. His voice hardened with frustration directed mostly at himself. That's exactly why I stayed away. Nothing changed for me until you were an adult, living your own life. But once it did, I knew crossing that line could destroy a friendship I've had for decades. I stepped closer. So instead you decided everything for both of us. Grant frowned. I was trying to do the right thing. For Dad. For everyone. Including me? Especially you. I shook my head. You don't get to decide what protects me without asking what I want. That stopped him. The old version of me might have softened the argument there. I might have made a joke, stepped back, given him an easy exit before he could give me one. I didn't. You kissed me because you wanted to, I said. And I kissed you back because I wanted to. That doesn't mean we have to know what this becomes. But pretending it didn't happen isn't protecting me. Grant looked at me for a long time. You think knowing I felt this way longer makes it easier? No, I glanced toward the cabin, then the lake beyond it. It makes it real. His expression shifted because we both understood the problem with that. The trip could no longer be blamed for creating whatever existed between us. Later, Grant checked the forecast. The road would be clear by morning. We could leave on schedule. 3 days earlier, that would have been good news. Now I watched him set his phone down and realized the cabin had stopped being the thing trapping us. Tomorrow we would go home. And once Grant was standing in the ordinary world again, surrounded by all the reasons he had avoided me for years, I would find out whether being wanted by him was enough to make him finally stop running. We packed the cabin in near silence the next morning. The storm had moved on, leaving the lake bright and almost unnaturally calm. I carried the tackle boxes to Grant's truck while he secured the fishing rods. Everything we had unloaded together 3 days earlier went back into the same places, except now every ordinary movement felt like part of a countdown. Grant checked the cabin twice, locked the door, then stood beside the truck with the keys in his hand. Ready? Yeah. The drive home began quietly. I watched trees pass outside my window and waited for Grant to say something about yesterday. 20 minutes passed before he finally did. When we get back, things need to go back to normal. I turned toward him. Normal. You know what I mean. Actually, I'd like to hear you say it. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. What happened at the cabin can't continue. There it was. I had expected the words, but expectation didn't make them hurt less. Because of Dad? Because of everything. Tom is my oldest friend. You're his son. There's 15 years between us. I should have thought about all of that before I kissed you. You did think about it. Apparently for years. Grant flinched. That's exactly the problem. No. The problem is that you keep talking like I wasn't there. He glanced at me. I'm trying to protect you. From what? Going on a date with someone I want. From what happens if this goes badly. Then let it go badly because we tried. Not because you decided I couldn't handle trying. Grant went quiet. I felt the familiar instinct to make it easier for him. To shrug, tell him the weekend had been fun, turn everything into something temporary before he could reject me. I had done that with other men. Leave first. Hurt less. But I was tired of pretending departure was the same thing as control. Listen to me, I said. If you choose your friendship with Dad over whatever this could be, I'll respect that. Grant looked over again. Ethan. But call it your choice. Don't tell me you're doing it for me. He had no answer. That silence lasted the rest of the drive. When Grant finally pulled into my driveway, the place looked exactly as it had when we left. For a moment I remembered standing there with Dad, believing the biggest surprise of the weekend was that he had canceled. Grant got out and helped me unload my duffel and fishing gear. He handed me the old spinning rod. Our fingers almost touched. This time neither of us pretended not to notice. "Ethan." I waited. Grant looked like he had a dozen sentences and trusted none of them. "I'm sorry." I swallowed. "I didn't ask you to be sorry." "I know." "Then figure out what you actually want." I took the rod from him. Every part of me wanted to ask when I would see him again. I didn't. That question belonged to Grant now. I picked up my bag and walked toward the house without looking back. The trip was over. The storm was gone. The lake was miles behind us. For the first time since Grant had kissed me, nothing in the world was forcing us together. If he wanted me now, he would have to choose me when staying away was easier. For 4 days, Grant gave me exactly what he had said he wanted. Normal. No calls. No messages. No excuse to stop by. I went to work, came home, and tried not to measure every ordinary hour against 3 days at the lake. By the 4th evening, I had started accepting the answer his silence seemed to give me. Maybe Grant could want me and still choose not to have me. Maybe the kiss had been real and still wasn't enough. I hated that possibility, but I had promised myself I wouldn't chase someone into choosing me. So when someone knocked on my door, Grant was the last person I expected to see. He stood on the porch without fishing gear, without my father, without any practical reason to be there. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. Grant entered, then stopped in the living room as if he had rehearsed what he wanted to say all the way over and forgotten it the moment he saw me. "For days," I said. "I know. That's a long time to figure out whether you want something." I knew what I wanted. His answer came immediately. The 4 days were me figuring out whether I was brave enough to accept what wanting it might cost. I didn't rescue him from the silence that followed. Grant took a breath. "You were right in the truck. I kept saying I was protecting you because that sounded better than admitting I was scared. Of Dad. Of losing Tom. Of hurting him. Of this going wrong and proving every reason I stayed away was justified." He looked directly at me. "But those are my risks. Not yours." Something in my chest tightened. Grant continued, "I'm not going to make your decision for you anymore. And I'm not going to ask you to be something I hide." "What does that mean?" "It means I'll deal with your father. Whatever that conversation costs me, it's mine to handle." He moved 1 step closer. "And it means if you still want this, I want to take you out." I stared at him. "Fishing?" For the first time since he arrived, Grant almost smiled. "No cabin. No boat. Absolutely not." His smile disappeared into something quieter. "A date, Ethan. An actual date. Somewhere neither of us can blame the weather." I felt myself smiling despite everything. "You needed 4 days for that?" "I needed about 10 minutes. I spent the other 3 days trying to talk myself out of it." "How'd that go?" Grant looked at me the same way he had on the porch at the cabin, except there was nowhere for him to retreat now. "I'm standing here." That was the answer. At the lake, circumstances had kept pushing us together. Dad. Canceling the cabin, the boat, the storm. Now all of it was gone. Grant could have stayed home and returned to the careful distance he had maintained for years. Instead, he had come to me. "Then yes," I said. His expression changed. "Yes, I'll go on a date with you." I stepped closer. "But there's something else." "What?" I kissed him. This time I was the one who closed the distance, and Grant answered without hesitation. His hand settled against my waist, but when we pulled apart, he didn't apologize. He didn't call it a mistake. He stayed. I rested my forehead briefly against his and laughed under my breath. "That's already an improvement. I'm learning. Slowly. I'm 42. Give me time." I laughed again, and the last of the tension broke with it. Nothing about what came next would be simple. Dad still existed. The age difference still existed. Grant's fear hadn't vanished simply because he had walked through my door. But for once, neither of us was using fear to leave first. The fishing trip had ended 4 days ago. Whatever this was, it had just begun. 3 weeks later, Grant pulled into my driveway just after sunrise. By then, we had learned that choosing each other once didn't magically make everything easy. His conversation with Dad had been every bit as awkward as Grant expected. Dad had questions. Grant had answers he clearly would have preferred giving under interrogation. There had been anger, silence, and several days when nobody seemed sure what to say next. But Grant never asked me to hide what we were, and Dad never got to make the decision for us. That mattered more than everything becoming comfortable overnight. Grant and I were dating. Actually dating. Dinner without excuses. Phone calls that didn't need a reason. Kisses that weren't followed by apologies. When I stepped outside that morning, Grant was leaning against his truck holding 2 coffees. He handed mine over. I took a sip. Black, 1 sugar. Still showing off? I asked. Apparently I remember unimportant things. I smiled at the callback. What are you doing here this early? I have a question. That sounds dangerous. Grant nodded toward the truck. Want to go? Fishing? I stared at him. Seriously? That's usually what people do with fishing rods. I glanced toward the truck bed and saw them. 2 rods already waiting beside our gear. Mine was the old spinning rod he had found before the first trip. Is Dad coming? I asked. Grant shook his head. No, there was no hesitation this time. Just us. If you want to. For a moment, I was back in the same driveway 3 weeks earlier, holding a duffel while Dad announced he couldn't go. That first trip had happened because somebody canceled. Because a cabin was already booked. Because circumstances put Grant and me in the same truck and sent us toward the same lake. This time nobody had canceled. There was no storm coming. No cabin trapping us together. No excuse at all. Grant had simply shown up because he wanted me beside him. I put my coffee in the cup holder, laid my gear next to his, and climbed into the passenger seat. Grant looked over at me. Ready? The first time he had asked me that question, I hadn't understood what I was agreeing to. I thought I was going fishing with my dad's best friend. I came home knowing Grant as the man who had spent years trying not to want me, and knowing myself as someone who could finally stop leaving before anyone had the chance to stay. Yeah, I said. I'm ready. Grant smiled and pulled onto the road toward the lake. This time, neither of us needed an excuse for where we were going together.